and I extend a very warm welcome to all of you for the first session of the Global Public Policy Program 2021 by the Centre for Policy Studies at JK Lakshmipat University in collaboration with the School of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I studied public policy at the London School of Economics, UK, and I am the program manager for the LSEF UMass Scholarship Program. It selects a cohort of exceptional scholars every year, offering them a generous scholarship to pursue a master's in public policy or resource economics or data analytics in computational social science, with first year at the JK Lakshmipat University in India and the second year at the UMass Amherst. The lecture today is the first in the series, which will comprise of 5 power-packed and interactive sessions by some of the most inspiring and accomplished faculties and public policy professionals from the UMass Amherst. Without much ado, I welcome our Honorable Pro-Vice Chancellor of JK Lakshmipat University, Ashish Gupta sir, who also serves on the advisory board of the Centre for Policy Studies at JKLU, and who was formerly a director at the global consulting firm McKinsey & Company, to kindly come and say a few words and kick off the program.
Thank you, Palak. A very good evening to everyone. I must say that we did not expect such an overwhelming response with several hundred participants registering for this global public policy program, which is spread over 5 sessions that we put together with the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst. But then again, with the faculty such as Professor Roberts, Professor Jane Fountain, Professor Michael Ash, and others, the opportunity to engage and learn is quite unique. So I think everyone has chosen quite well. At JKLU and Lakshmipat Singhania Educational Foundation, our mission is really to make the best education in the world accessible to students from India. And we are fortunate to have the support of University of Massachusetts Amherst, one of the top-ranked public universities in the US in this mission. As Palak mentioned, together we offer scholarships for pursuing master's program at JKLU and UMass Amherst. And a number of outstanding scholars have taken advantage of this in the past 2 years. The applications for this year are open. Selected students will spend their first year in India and the second year at Amherst. This series is also a step in the same direction to help those who may be working in or aspire to work in policy areas to get a better understanding of the, what the landscape is and the state of thinking and research on some contemporary issues, policy issues globally, are directly from the acclaimed faculty of the program. Today, even businesses recognize the huge role of policy in strategy and performance. And with the reimagined curriculum at schools like UMass, in many ways, a degree in policy could well become the new MBA. So we have an exciting session today with none other than the director of the Public Policy School, Professor Al Roberts. I once again welcome you and also take this opportunity to invite you to take full advantage of the series by participating in all the 5 sessions. Over to you, Palak. You're on mute, Palak.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your enlightening words and giving the attendees the right direction to move ahead. Now, I'm going to invite and have the privilege of introducing our faculty for the session, Professor Alasdair Roberts. Professor Alasdair Roberts is the director of the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst, and he is a renowned expert and commentator on governance, on law, and public policy. Professor Roberts received his first degree in law from the University of Toronto in 1984, a master's degree in public policy from the Howard University in 1986, and a PhD in public policy from Howard University in 1994. His most recent books, The Strategies for Governing, was published by Cornell University Press. He has authored several other award-winning books, including Can Government Do Anything Right?, For Crisis of American Democracy, The End of Protest, How Free Market Capitalism Learned to Control Dissent, America's First Great Depression, The Logic of Discipline, Global Capitalism and the Architecture of Government, and Blacked Out, Government Secrecy in the Information Age. Professor Roberts was elected as a Fellow of the US National Academy of Public Administration in 2007. Prior to UMass Amherst, Professor Roberts taught public administration at the faculty of Queen's University in Canada and at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. He was Jerome L. Rappaport Professor of Law and Public Policy at Suffolk University and a Professor of Public Affairs, Political Science, and Law at the University of Missouri. Professor Roberts has also been involved with the Right to Information Initiative in India and has been a very regular visitor at our own JK Lakshmipat University in Jaipur. Today, he will be speaking on the challenges of policymaking in the 21st century. And we are very glad to host this talk here. Now, a gentle reminder to all the attendees, you can post your questions in the chat box while the speaker delivers his lecture, and your questions will then be picked in order of occurrence to be answered on the speaker's discretion after the session is over. I now request Professor Alasdair to begin with his session and enlighten us with his words.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share screen and show some slides. And let me just get that started right now. So can you see, are you seeing a PowerPoint screen right now? And let me just check, because sometimes I just want to make sure, is the screen, are the slides changing?
Yes, they are.
Okay, good. I once gave a presentation where I gave the entire presentation and I realized I was the only one who was seeing the slides change. So we want to avoid that. Good evening, everybody. And I should also say good morning, because I'm speaking to you from Amherst, Massachusetts. And it's 7:30 in the morning here, so the day will be brightening as I go along. It is a real honor and a treat to be participating in this seminar series. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in Jaipur personally, but obviously because of circumstances, it's difficult to travel at the moment. But I've had the pleasure of visiting India many times over the last 20 years, and I am looking forward to the time in the next year when it's possible to travel again. I started off doing a lot of work on right to information in India about 20 years ago, and I keep in touch with many people who are active on that topic, as well as other topics in India. And I would also like to express my thanks to JKLU for this opportunity to speak. At University of Massachusetts Amherst, we're very excited about the partnership that we have launched with JKLU, and it's been a pleasure to work with the talented faculty in Jaipur. And we're very excited about the joint program that we have put together that allows students to commence a career in public policy or other fields by commencing a one-year program of study at JKLU and then coming to the University of Massachusetts Amherst for a graduate degree after that. I thought I would show you, this is just a picture of our campus. This is a part of the main campus. It's not the whole of the campus, where if you look at the map, Massachusetts is a state in the upper northeast part of the United States. It's sort of shaped in a rectangle. Boston, the capital of the state, is right on the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. The blue dot on the left-hand side is roughly where Amherst is. We are in an area called the Berkshires, the Berkshire Mountains of Western Massachusetts. It is a beautiful area to visit. We have a substantial campus. This is the flagship campus, as they say, the main campus of this university. There are 3 other campuses of the university across the state as well. And we have about 5,000 faculty and staff on this campus. And the School of Policy Studies has itself about 20 faculty who specialize in public policy, and several of them will be speaking in this series over the next month. So I guess the only thing I should qualify is that it is, obviously we're in a pandemic right now. We are working remotely for the next few months. So I am broadcasting from my home, not my office. But we're expecting that we're making progress with vaccine rollout and preventative measures, and I think we can be reasonably confident that we will be returning to normal operations by midsummer. The one difference of, I may not have said this yet, is that of course it's covered, the land is covered in snow right now. We have about 6 inches of snow here in Amherst, and it is a unusually brisk morning, so it's about 11 degrees below centigrade right now. That's a little colder than usual for this time of year. So what I'm going to do today are two things. I know that many of you will have joined this session because you'd be interested in knowing a bit about what the field of public policy is about. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to talk about the field of public policy, and then I will talk about some of the main challenges that the field experts in public policy have been confronting in recent years in the United States and in India. But let me tell you a word first about the field of public policy. This is and I should say by way of background, as was mentioned in the introduction, I started my undergraduate studies in political science, and I then completed a law degree, and then I moved into political science. So I looked around in different areas before I ended up in the field of public policy. So the field of public policy is a scholarly field. It's a field with its own sort of character and boundaries, like political science or economics. There are around the world, and especially in the United States, many departments or schools that specialize in public policy, or sometimes public policy and administration. And they offer degrees like a master's in public policy, an MPP, a master's in public administration in some places, and a PhD in public policy for those who are interested in going even further in the area. So this is a well-defined, well-established scholarly area in the United States. It really got going in about the late 1960s or early 1970s. So it's been around for at least 50 years. The Kennedy School at Harvard University, where I got my degree, was established, I believe, in 1969. The school I presently direct, the predecessor program, was established in 1972. So this is a familiar and well-established field in the US and many other countries. And it's not just a scholarly field. There are experts, professionals who go on to careers in public policy analysis. Very often they work in government agencies, providing advice on policy formulation or evaluation of policies. Sometimes they work for elected officials, giving advice on the drafting of legislation or new policies. Sometimes they work for advocacy groups or non-governmental groups that are trying to persuade government to adopt new policies. And sometimes they work for businesses that are regulated by government or might be regulated by government. These businesses also need to have experts who know how government works, how government shapes policy. So this is not just a degree for people who are going in government. It's basically a degree for anybody who is either in government or working around government. It's a fairly broadly applicable degree. It differs from other disciplines in the sense that it is problem-oriented and prescriptive. And by that I mean it's concerned with generating a recommendation about what to do about a specific policy problem. So some other disciplines sometimes are trying to explain or describe the way the world works. In public policy, we need to know something about the way the world works, but the ambition is to provide a concrete recommendation about how to make the world better. So that is a distinctive focus of this degree, and it is also a professional degree. More than, say, political science or economics. We are training people to go out in the world of practice, so we're very concerned with developing professional skills. effective communication, for example. And I would also say that there is a difference between the work that we do in public policy and the work that you might see done by some advocacy or mobilization groups, campaign groups, we might say, because we do try to aim for dispassionate analysis. That is to say, we look at the evidence, we look at the facts, and we try to go where the evidence or the facts lead us. So we try to be grounded in a concrete, realistic understanding of circumstances. So that roughly is that's a snapshot of what the field of public policy is about. The craft of policy analysis, as I said, is principally concerned with finding the best possible solution to a public problem. Best might not mean, sometimes means most efficient response to a problem, but there are other considerations too. For example, the most fair or just solution to a problem. And we proceed systematically. I won't walk through this in too much detail, but in our line of work, the basic framework is that we try to understand and define problems using the best available evidence, define alternate ways of solving problems, the so-called policy options. We try to think carefully about the standards or criteria that we use to judge alternate solutions, evaluate those different options, and then recommend or choose the best available option. And this seems very straightforward. It's sort of what you would do when you go into a restaurant, I suppose, and you're trying to decide what to have for dinner. It's a much more sophisticated exercise than that, of course. But the thing that I emphasize for my students is that this is actually a radical project, because it is a distinctive way of thinking about how to use government power. And it is different. It rejects alternate ways. Basically, it rejects tradition, for example. It does not accept that we continue doing things one way simply because these are the way things have always been done. It rejects arguments from authority. We don't exercise power in a certain way just because somebody in charge has told us this is the way it will be done. We think for ourselves about the best way of using governmental power. And it rejects peer pressure. The premise is that policymakers in every country should think for themselves about what the right solution for a problem in their circumstances should be. So the fact that every other country is doing one thing doesn't mean that policymakers in India should do the same thing. We don't accept that argument about peer pressure or following the pack. So it's a very exciting field in which to work. And I've been privileged to be working in it for now about 35 years, I suppose. So I would say too that in my own view, I'm not American, and by the way, I'm Canadian, but I worked in the United States for many years. But the United States and India actually have a great deal in common. They have a common project, I think, that is going to be very important in this century, and I will come back to this argument later on at the end of the presentation. What do they have in common? They have in common institutions. They are both dedicated to the idea that leaders ought to be selected democratically through some system of popular voting. That system isn't always perfect. It doesn't always work very well, as you will know from watching the news from the United States recently, but there is an aspiration to make democratic processes work well. And that is very different from the mode of governance that is dominant in China today. Also, both systems are committed, at least in principle, to the notion of individual rights and the rule of law. They are both federal systems, and I will talk about that in a moment too. They are both highly complex government apparatuses. You know, in Washington, in the United States, everybody focuses on Washington all the time, but the central government in the United States is only one government. There are 55, I believe, state and territorial governments as well. and over 90,000 local governments. There, we focus a lot on the president, who is one elected official, but there are in fact more than 500,000 elected officials in the United States. And I could tell a similar story in India as well. Obviously, there's one central government, but there are many state and territorial governments, and I believe more than 250,000 local governments as well. And I am sure that there are more than 1 million elected officials in India as well. So complex institutional arrangements, both very big countries in terms of territory with very large populations. One of the impressive things that, India will be the most populous country in the world by 2050. I believe its estimated population will be 1.4 billion people. India is going to have an extraordinary challenge in the coming decades. It will govern a country that has more people in it than any other country has ever experienced in world history. In fact, the population of India in 2050 will exceed the total world population in 1890. So very big countries and very diverse and what I will call activated populations. What do I mean by activated? Urbanized. I'm not sure if it is correct for India, but most of the world's population now lives in cities. This is a very recent change, only in the last few years. Most of the world's population is now literate, better educated, mobile, easier to get around, and wired. Everybody has a smartphone. And these sort of basic facts make governance much more challenging. You have a population that isn't just sitting in one place all of the time. They're moving around, and they're better informed, and they're better able to organize themselves. And I would say too that these two countries also have in common legacies of inequality and injustice that they are trying to remedy. And in the American case, of course, that is principally concerned with the question of racial justice, the question of fair treatment of the Black American population. So that's what these two countries have in common. I think there is a lot to learn between each other. I don't think Americans have got all the answers to the questions of governance. And indeed, I think they have a lot to learn from India. There are some ways in which Indian practice is exemplary, not just for the US, but for the world. Particularly impressive, for example, the way that India runs its elections. So that's what the two countries have in common. I'm going to talk now just about 6 of the kind of basic challenges, and I will walk through these big challenges of public policy very quickly. One of the reasons I love this field is because everything is complicated. Every policy problem is like a puzzle. And what you're constantly doing is puzzle solving. How am I going to solve this complicated problem? And there are 2 difficulties. The difficulties is, one of the difficulties is that circumstances are always changing. So just when you think you have the puzzle solved, the puzzle becomes complicated. The puzzle unsolves itself, as it were. And the other difficulty is that you're not just solving one puzzle, you're solving multiple puzzles at the same time. And the way you solve one puzzle affects all of the other puzzles. So dealing with multiple policy challenges at the same time is extraordinarily difficult. But this work is very important because this is the way that we make the world a better place for people in our country. So briefly, the 6 challenges I'm just going to walk through. One big challenge in India and the United States is building state capacity. That is something that we focus on quite heavily. What does this mean? Much of the time, it means building bureaucracies or a public service or civil service that is filled with competent people, that is honest, that is to say, not corrupt, that is principled in the way it uses its authority, What do I mean by that? That people with power, like policemen, treat people fairly. They give them the appropriate due process. Bureaucracies that are good with spending public money and that are responsive to the needs of people in communities. And this is a extraordinarily difficult challenge. It's sometimes even more complicated because a great deal of what government does is not being done just through their own bureaucracy. So for example, very often people in central government are working with other levels of government, state governments, local governments, or with private businesses or non-governmental organizations. They're working in teams or networks to achieve public results. And this is sometimes called networked governance. And this is a real challenge. How do you, if you're in central government, make sure that state or local government does what you would like them to do? How do you monitor to make sure that they're doing what you would like them to do? I'll give you an example of that from the United States. President Biden, when he came into office, announced that he would have 3 major goals for the first 100 days of his presidency. He said he was going to encourage Americans to wear masks to prevent the spread of COVID, the disease. He said that he would aim to have 100 million people vaccinated within the first 100 days of his presidency. And he said he would try to have the majority of schools opened for normal activities by the end of the 100 days. And the interesting thing about these goals is that the president or the federal government doesn't have the authority by itself to achieve any of these goals. So for example, in the United States, schools are run by local governments. They're 2 or 3 levels down from Washington, and they're spread, of course, all over the country. The business of getting vaccine shots, the United States central government itself does not do vaccinations. Vaccinations are done by state governments or agencies below state governments, perhaps local governments or private actors. And similarly, the federal government has very little authority to tell people, force people to wear masks. This is true in many other countries as well. There are limits to what you can tell people to do. It's very easy to ignore an instruction to wear a mask if you don't want to wear a mask. So this is all about, in a way, networked governance. This shows the complexities of getting things done because very often the people at the top don't have the direct authority to accomplish the goals that they think are important for the country. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge I just want to talk briefly about is the challenge of working in a federal system. In a way, I've already touched on this when I talked about President Biden's goals for the first 100 days. But working in a federal system and trying to get central government and state governments and local governments heading in the same direction is very challenging. There are important questions about what the appropriate roles of different levels of government should be. There are important questions, for example, about what central government should do to address inequalities between regions. What do you do if certain parts of India are growing more rapidly than other parts? How do you fix that problem? How do you promote economic integration? How do you encourage different parts of India to engage in commerce with one another? That's not just an economic project, that's also a political project because getting trade between parts of the country is a way of holding the country together. What is the role of central government in promoting a common identity or in promoting common citizenship? And I will come back to this in a moment. So there's important questions that have to be resolved about what different levels of government ought to be doing. Another predicament is what is the central government specifically capable of doing? What is it reasonably possible to expect that central government can do if it has to work through lower levels of government? Because you might say, well, in a perfect world, I would like the central government to do a certain thing. But as a matter of practice, I can see that it is very difficult for the central government actually to execute that goal. So an interesting question about whether central government should have much to do with education policy and the operation of schools, given that every school is so distant from the capital of the country as a whole. There have been some very interesting trends, and I think perhaps the trends go in opposite directions in the United States and in India. In both countries, obviously, there are very big debates about what the right role of the center and states should be. In the United States, the tendency over the last 30 or 40 years has been for the central government to pick up more power. And partly this is because of the way the world is changing. The way the media environment is changing, it means that when you watch the news now, increasingly the news you see in the United States is news about Washington. So there is this tendency, because of the advent of new kinds of media, for policy debate to be focused on the national capital. And that leads to the tendency to think that the national capital should be solving problems. I have the impression in India since the 1980s, the balance of power between the center and states has been changing in a different way. That is to say, states have been growing in influence. But there is still that question about what the appropriate role of the center should be. So that's the second big challenge. The third big challenge is, you're going to have to excuse me, my slides are a little mixed up here. So let me just get back on my track. Actually, this is a slide that actually ties to the right, the previous point, the basic question of how you manage in a federal system. These are just some pictures that show a couple of different things. The picture in the top left shows the states. The red states are the states that ultimately voted for President Trump in the last election. The blue states are the states that voted for President Biden. I picked a few other slides. If you look at the slide in the bottom right corner, the green and orange slide, you'll notice that there's sort of roughly similar to the first slide. In this slide, this is a slide that shows which way states lined up in a recent Supreme Court case about the Affordable Care Act, which is President Obama's national health insurance plan. And the green states opposed President Obama's plan, and the orange states supported President Obama's plan. So if you look at it, those two pictures together, you see, oh, they're sort of roughly similar. There was a big division in the country, and still is, about what the appropriate role of central government should be in the provision of health services. And if you look at the other charts, which are about protection of individual rights and access to abortions, reproductive rights, you can see sort of a similar pattern. And the point I would make here is that one of the big challenges in the United States today is sorting out what the role of the central government should be, given that there are such big and broad divisions in the country as a whole about fundamental questions of social and economic policy. I'm going to talk now a bit about managing the market. I've put a couple of pictures in here about protests. The one on the right is a picture from the Occupy protests. These were protests against Wall Street, the financial capital of the United States. back in 2009 after the global financial crisis. And the picture on the left is farmer protests from India much more recently. So the third big challenge is managing the market. And in both India and the United States, there has been more of a pro-market emphasis in recent decades. This premise that if you want economic growth, you have to reduce the role of government in controlling economic activity. And this has resulted, especially in the Indian case, in more rapid growth, but there are trade-offs. There are difficulties that come along with economic liberalization. Rising inequality between different parts of the country, rising inequality between individuals, this problem of sectoral shifts and dislocations, that is, parts of the economy, sectors of the economy that are especially hard hit because of changes, perhaps agriculture in India, manufacturing in the United States. And another pressure is economic crises, economic shocks, like an exchange shock or a global financial crisis, and so on. And so even though we have been on this path of liberalization, there are still immense challenges here, questions about what the role of government should be in economic planning. You know, in India, the government eliminated the Planning Commission and put in Niti Aayog instead. Still raises the question of what government should be doing in terms of providing overall economic guidance. How do we provide essential infrastructure, roads, airports, ports, and so on? How do we regulate effectively so that businesses know what the rules of the game are in a stable way over a period of years? How do we prevent government by getting captured, as we sometimes say, by very wealthy players, by billionaires? And how do we protect people from economic risks? How do we protect ordinary people from the worst kinds of economic shocks? So this is the third big challenge we deal with, this question of not just how you liberalize, but how you deal with all the problems that come with liberalization. I'll just touch on a couple of other problems. One problem that I'm going to talk about in a moment is managing public trust. How do you retain public trust in government? I'm going to show you some data from the United States. That chart shows the proportion of Americans who trust government in Washington, that is to say central government, to do the right thing most of the time. And you can see that the proportion of people who trust central government has declined sharply over the decades. And this is a major problem for central government in the United States. Interestingly, though, if you look at trust data for state and local government in the United States, the data is usually much better. So 72% of Americans, according to this poll, say they trust local government, 63% trust state government. So in the American case, the closer government gets to the people, the more trust there is. Interestingly, according to this recent poll from India, it does not work the same way in India. Trust in all levels of government is, by American standards, fairly high, and actually trust in central government appears to be a little bit higher than trust in local government. But this question of how you maintain the trust of the people is a big problem. It involves sorting out how to communicate effectively with the public about public policy, very challenging because of the rise of new social media. How do you achieve transparency in government through policies like right to information law? How do you allow the public to participate directly when government makes new laws or new regulations? To what extent do you allow individuals to choose public services? In the American case, how much do you allow them to choose which school they will send their children to? And all of these are techniques for giving power to citizens, and the hope is that by doing this, we will restore trust in government. I'll just talk about one more one more challenge, and that is the challenge of, no, there's two more, but I'll go briefly. One is the next challenge is basically the challenge of achieving full and equal citizenship. And this is a protest about Black Lives Matters from earlier in 2020. The big problem, or a big problem in the United States, is the question of racial justice. How do you assure equal treatment, fair and equal treatment for Black Americans who have historically been oppressed in the American context? But I would argue that this is many other countries have similar problems that they are wrestling with as well. So the fifth big challenge is this question of how do you achieve full and equal citizenship? Partly this is about political rights. How do you make sure everybody in the country is got the same right opportunity to vote? How do we make sure that they are being treated by police fairly? How do we make sure that when they are charged with a crime, they get a fair trial, and that the sentences they get don't depend on their class or social grouping or race? And then there is also another question about what are the other elements that are necessary to protect human rights? How do we assure that people get adequate health care? How do we assure that people get an adequate education? This is an immense challenge, obviously, in India today as well. How do we assure that young people get good access to high quality education? And I should say too, there's a connection here too, because being a citizen shouldn't change much depending on what part of the country you live in. Being a citizen in the south of India should be the same as being a citizen in the north of India. You want to have, to the extent that you can, a standard understanding of what citizenship involves. But I also noted that one of the other debates is about how much central government can do and whether state governments should be allowed more authority, or how you manage political differences between parts of the country. So one of the interesting tensions in public policy is, on the one hand, you want citizenship to mean the same thing across the country. On the other hand, there are limits to the capacity of central government to make sure that people are treated the same way in all parts of the country. So I'll just talk about one last challenge. And this is a challenge that we're especially attentive to recently, and this is the problem of resilience. How do we change the system as a whole so that it is capable of dealing with new stresses and new shocks? Because the world as a whole is constantly changing. And government has to be nimble. It has to be flexible in responding to new circumstances. And some of those changes come slowly. We call them stresses. Changes in the population, for example. In the American case, the problem is population aging, the growth of the older group in the population. China also has a problem of population aging. In India, the challenge is somewhat different. It has to do with a surge in the proportion of young people in the population. Geopolitical changes. How do we all deal with the rise of China as a great power? Technological changes. How do we deal with the effects of automation on the workplace, the availability of jobs, and of course, climate change. And then in addition to these kind of slow moving changes, we have shocks, terror attacks, financial crises, natural disasters, pandemics, and so on. And one of the interesting challenges is basically basically thinking about how government can respond quickly and competently to these sudden and very important changes. So I'll stop in a moment, but I want to make a big observation. I've talked about 6 smaller policy challenges. I want to now just roll it all together and make an observation about a very big challenge. And that is, I think, the challenge of this century. So I've shown you, this is a projection of the world economy from a company called PwC. They're estimating what share of the world economy will be accounted for by 4 big jurisdictions: China, the United States, the European Union, and India. And what you can see this chart telling you is that China's share of the world economy will go from about 18% today to about 20% by 2050. The next biggest chunk of the world economy will be claimed by India. It will be about 15% of the world economy by 2050. And the United States and the European Union will still be important parts of the world economy, but their relevance will decline. And interestingly, by 2050, just doing the math quickly, about half of the global economy will be accounted for by just these 4 jurisdictions. So there are 167 other countries in the world, but half of the world economy and almost half of the world population will be in these 4 places. And the interesting thing too is that the biggest chunk of the global economy will be accounted for by China, and China will not be, well, maybe things will change, but at the moment, China is an authoritarian state. It is not a democracy. Its respect for human rights is limited in important ways. I grew up in a world in which the world's biggest economy could also make a reasonable claim to being a democracy. In my time, democracy seemed to be in the vanguard. It seemed to be leading the world. This century is going to be a little different because the world's biggest economic actor will not be a democracy. It will be an authoritarian state. And the burden on the rest of us is to show that democracy can work. And this is a common struggle between people in the United States and people in India, which is and will be the world's most populous democracy, and the European Union too. So our very big challenge this century is to show that we can get all the fundamentals done, that we can provide security for people, we can provide prosperity for people, we can provide justice for people, we can adapt to new stresses and new shocks, and we can do all of this while respecting the principle of democracy. And that's a huge task, but it's a very exciting and important one. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons why it's exciting to be working in the field of public policy. So I will stop there, and I will stop sharing slides too, and be glad to engage in discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Alasdair, for the wonderful, astonishing points about the challenges. It was such a great thing to know at this point of time, at a juncture where even US is moving towards new political atmosphere, the kind of similarities you drew between India and the US system and how the future holds the potential for both of these countries. It was great to listen to all of it. Now we have a few questions from the audience, and in the remaining time, I hope we can help answer these questions for a while. So I'd be taking the first question from Unnati Tolani. The question is, do corporate companies have scope of employing public policy analysis?
The answer is yes, because many companies are regulated by government, or they are dependent on government decisions, trade, conditions of work, and so on, and the share of market. So many large companies have offices that in the United States would be called government relations offices. And they are concerned, they need to know how to talk to government agencies. They need to understand how government agencies think. They need to know, for example, what kind of evidence or what kind of studies government actors need to make the right kind of decisions. So many companies have public policy specialists to help them deal with their governmental partners. You know, it's just like, if I could just elaborate, you know,
Yeah.
so every business is like an organism that has to connect with other organisms. You know, it has to connect with its
Right.
customers, has to connect with suppliers, it has to connect with governments. And every big company has to have a part of its operations that knows how to connect with these other parts, including government.
Correct, correct. Thank you so much, sir. I hope, Unnati, your question is answered. We would now move to Prav's question. He says, I'm working as a policy advisor for small business currently, and his struggle is that he finds while researching and advising on policies, it seems that policies we advise on are often double-sworded. Definitely creates negative implications to some set of people with any intervention. So how do we conclude which is the best or better advice than the other?
That's exactly right. And you know, we often say that policymaking is often about trade-offs, right? They're very rarely a solution that makes everybody better off. If you find a solution where everybody is better off, you are a very lucky person. So very often the question is sorting out what is the right trade-off to make. And this is why it's not just about efficiency when you're thinking about policy design, it's also about fairness and justice. What do different groups deserve? And sometimes it's an intergenerational question. You know, it's a question of what advantages people today, what will advantage people in the future. So you are constantly thinking about these ethical or social justice questions about what's the right way to do. And then the other thing too is it's a political question of, okay, I've got a policy that I think is the right way to go for the country. It's going to benefit some people immediately, but some people will be harmed immediately. In the long run, they might be better off, but in the short run, they're going to be harmed. So how do I fix that? Can I think of some way of compensating the people who are harmed so that they benefit? That we're recognizing the costs they are bearing. Agricultural reform in India is a very good example of that right now. Privatization of public sector undertakings is another example. You know, when you privatize an enterprise, workers are probably going to lose their jobs. In the long run, it might be that privatization is the right thing to do. In the short run, what do you do to help the workers who are going to lose their jobs? So this is a critically important question.
Thank you so much. We'll take one more question from Swastika. The role of political will in public policy. If you could shed some light on this topic.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. How do you get political leaders to do the right thing? And I'm not sure I have a neat answer on that. This has a lot to do with the design of political processes. That is making sure that political institutions are designed in such a way that political leaders have the incentive to do the right thing. Are they looking, for example, at the long term? A lot of what we do sometimes is designing institutions so that leaders make the right long-term decisions. One example that I mentioned in one of my books is the way we design central banks, like the Reserve Bank of India. We give these banks independence. We try to give these banks independence. And the premise is that way experts in the bank will make the right kind of decisions on monetary policy, on questions about what interest rates should be. So that's an interesting example of designing an institution so that it is buffered, it's given some autonomy so that it will make the right long-term decision. In a way, that's about creating circumstances where there is the will to act the right way. And we try doing that in some other ways as well. You know, when we talk about bringing in private partners to run major parts of infrastructure, like airports, the premise is that we are doing it because then the people running this infrastructure will have the independence that allows them to make the right long-run decision. And then just finally, an important part of this is about communication. That is, how do you tell a story to people about why it is that doing the right thing will be in their long-run interest?
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for this answer. We'd be just taking one more question because it's already like past 7, so we won't do it. I'm really sorry for the 36 questions that we have here. It's really like disheartening. The one question that we can take is, does the US government use tools such as RCTs, like the behavioral economics, to understand important behaviors to influence these challenges in the public policy space?
I'm sorry, I missed a part of that question. Could you just repeat it?
Yes. Does the US government use tools such as the RCTs, the one developed by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, in the behavioral economics, to understand important behaviors to influence these challenges in the public policy space?
Yes. There is not just RCTs, but other sophisticated techniques of using collecting and interpreting data to understand what the right kind of policy would be. So in our curriculum, for example, we teach courses in methods, and including statistical methods. And of course, people who go on for more advanced studies develop even more refined methods. But this goes back to the point I was making right at the start, that one of the things that public policy analysis emphasizes is not just having opinions on what the right thing to do would be, but doing the best you can to collect data and interpret data rigorously so that you know what's likely to work.
Correct. Thank you so much, sir. I guess we'll have to wrap the session now. For the rest of the questions, we request all of you to keep attending the next few sessions that we have so that your questions can be answered by eminent faculty members from the University of Amherst. Thank you, Professor Alasdair, for enlightening us with this amazing talk and making us aware of the challenges to democracy, to public policy in the future. We have a few questions that we have answered and a few questions that we'll be answering in further sessions. But this talk on challenges of policymaking in the 21st century has enlightened us and our minds. A heartfelt thanks to all our participants for their patience and their engagement during the session, and our eminent faculty members who have attended the talk from the JK LU and University of Massachusetts Amherst. With this, I wish you on behalf of the JK Lakshmipat University and UMass Amherst an enjoyable evening, and we look forward to hosting all of you for our next sessions on the coming Saturday on 20th of February at the very same time, 6 to 7 p.m. on enacting digital government, a topic that is so relevant in today's context with digital businesses, education, and also digital activism. We look forward to seeing you there. Till then, stay safe and connected. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Wonderful session. Thank you, Alice. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I didn't go too long. I apologize for that.
This was just on time.
Thank you.
Everything perfect. Thank you.
All right, good. Well, have a good evening, everybody.
You too.
You too. You too.
So very much.
Good morning to you.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.